Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We are very pleased that our next speaker came all the way from upstairs to give us a talk. Our next speaker is Sebastian Rowe, who's a postdoc now at Microsoft, and he is going to be talking about big trees from short sequences.
Is this working? Yeah? Okay, so I'm going to give sort of a biased survey about some recent theoretical results that we have about reconstructing large phylogenies. And questions of the type, how fast and how much data do you need to do that? So these are, so my main collaborators have been Kostas Daskalakis from Berkeley and Elchanan Mosel. And also I did some related work with Christian and Jennifer. Okay, so yesterday, Joe Felsenstein talked about these different phylogenetic methods that you can use to reconstruct phylogenies, and one of them was called distance matrix methods. And one of the things he said about them were, I think it was a disadvantage, that mathematicians somehow really love these distance matrix methods. And I think he said beyond reason. So you can argue about what's reasonable. I'm actually going to spend half the talk talking about distance matrix methods. And if anything, I'm going to prove his point. But hopefully, you'll see a little bit why we love these methods. So Joe mentioned that they have this sort of nice, this elegant geometry behind them. This is sort of just half of the story. There's also a more pragmatic side to this, which is these are really the only techniques for which we can prove that they work in a very sort of strong sense. For some of them, at least, we can show that they can build the correct phylogeny in a sort of reasonable amount of time, with a reasonable amount of data, under reasonable assumptions on how this data was produced. And you can certainly poke holes through all these reasonable claims. It's not bulletproof, but somehow, from a theoretical perspective, this is the best that we've been able to come up so far. So I'm going to talk in particular about how you can sort of move beyond neighbor joining, which is the best known of these algorithms, but not quite the best of these algorithms, to give very efficient reconstruction techniques for large phylogenies. And then I'll move to I'll show actually how you can actually do even better, but now you have to use different tools, and in particular you have to use some ideas from statistical physics. So it turns out that the standard model of evolution that several people have talked about yesterday and today is very closely related to a model that physicists use to study spin systems, and in particular to explain things like magnetism. And the insight that they have about these systems turns out to be useful for reconstructing phylogenies. Okay. So let me just start by telling you what is our sort of general approach to these problems. I'll go through some of the things that people have said before, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows what I'm talking about. So my problem is this. I have a bunch of species. I get some DNA sequences from them, aligned sequences, and I'd like to reconstruct their evolutionary history, so the phylogenetic tree that sort of led to them. And in particular, I'm going to focus, as I said, on large-scale phylogeny. So think hundreds or thousands of species. And I'd like to construct algorithms that are sort of efficient. And there's really two different ways in which an algorithm can be efficient. There's the computational complexity. How much time does it take to go from the data to your tree? And then there's what I call the information theoretic efficiency, which is how much data do you actually need? How long do your DNA sequences need to be to get a good tree with high confidence? Okay, so all our results are going to be based on a very sort of fundamental assumption, which is that our data is going to be generated by one of those standard models of evolution. So several people have talked about this already. I have a tree, which is fixed. I start at the root with some value g, say, and then I go down the tree, and I have this continuous time Markov process that sort of jumps from one state to another according to these rates. So along this edge, for example, and an interval delta t, if I start with g, you would have a probability u over 3 times delta t of sort of jumping from to a or c or t. And you do that independently on each edge until you have one state for each leaf, which are my observed species. And now this is what happens on one site if I just consider mutations. And then what I have is a sequence of sites which are all independent samples from this model. So here I show you the sort of Juke scatter model, which is the sort of symmetric matrix on 4 letters. In general, at least in the first part of the talk, the results will apply to much more general transition matrices of the type that John showed earlier. And then in the second part, so I mean, there's going to be different rates for different transitions, and these branch lengths don't have to give, well, you could have different things on different branches. And now, in the second part, I'll focus on a simpler model, which is the CFN model, which is the Juke scatter model that I've mapped to 0, 1. So AG is going to be 0, and CT is going to be 1, and I have this symmetric kernel between them. Okay, so more formally, this is the problem I want to solve. I have these observed species, and I think of the sequences as being k samples from one of those models. And then what I want to do is to find some map that maps these sequences to a tree. And I'd like this tree to be the correct tree with high confidence. Okay, so this is the type of result that we'd like to do. And I care about how much time does it take as a function of the number of species, and also how large should k be as a function of the number of species. So how long my sequences need to be to get this kind of high confidence result. Okay, so let's see what the sort of classical methods give in this framework. So this is one of the methods that Joe talked about. So in maximum likelihood, you just look at the likelihood of a certain data set given a certain tree and transition matrices, and you just find the tree that maximizes the likelihood. So this method has at least one property, which is it's statistically consistent. So if I have infinitely long sequences, eventually this estimate is going to converge to the correct tree. But now if you look at the 2 criteria that I had before, things are not so great. So first of all, the problem was open for a while, but we showed recently that maximum likelihood, computing the maximum likelihood tree is actually NP-hard. In fact, NP-hard to approximate, so even getting close to the optimal solution is NP-hard. I'm not going to show you the proof. It's sort of based on the fact that parsimony itself is NP-hard to approximate, and you sort of reduce parsimony to maximum likelihood. And then on the information theoretic complexity side, as far as I know, we don't really know how fast somehow the trees converges to the real tree. So I don't know how long these sequences. It might actually be very good in practice or even in theory, but we don't have any good bounds on how much data you really need. And now if you look at other techniques like parsimony, this situation is similar. Actually, parsimony from a theoretical point of view is even worse in that it's not even consistent. And Bayesian methods also have their own problems. You don't know how much time it takes to converge and so on. So what we'd like to do is come up with some new techniques that are efficient both computationally and information theoretically, at least in theory. Okay, so I want to emphasize one point, which is there's really 2 general different approaches that you could take for a problem like this. One is you could consider arbitrary data sets and say what happens on arbitrary data sets. So the NP hardness result for maximum likelihood is of this type. If you give an arbitrary data set, how much time does it take to find the maximum likelihood tree? Whereas what we do is different. So the result I'm going to talk about later on are the data set is actually assumed to fit one of the standard models of evolution. So I assume somehow that my data was generated according to a model like this. So you can sort of think of this as sort of worst case versus average case, maybe in a sense. So there's going to be 2 important parameters. One is n is going to be the number of species, and k is going to be my sequence length. Okay, so most of the techniques, most of the work that's been done on rigorous, sort of provably efficient reconstruction algorithms has been based on distance matrix methods. And let me just give you my take on distance matrix methods. Suppose that, okay, so the idea is you have this tree. Suppose that I assign positive weights on each one of the edges. That's going to define a notion of distance between my leaves, which is just going to be the distance between 1 and 3 would be the sum of the edge weights on the path between 1 and 3. And now it turns out that once you have this distance matrix on the leaves, that sort of characterizes the tree. You can actually recover efficiently the tree from the distance matrix. Okay, so the name of the game becomes, you want to choose these edge weights in a way somehow that they're related to the transition probabilities, so that eventually you'll be able to estimate the distances from your data. So in particular, for the CFN case, for example, if you choose lambda a to be the log of 1 minus 2 times the probability that there's a change on edge E, and now if you look at the distance matrix, which is now the sum of these edge weights on a path, that turns out to be an expression of this type, which is just the probability that the two sides disagree. So this is something you can estimate from the data. You can just look at the Hamming distance between your sequences, and there's a sort of correction in a way with this logarithm to make it into an actual distance matrix. And so this kind of matrix or this kind of distance is called an additive metric or an additive distance matrix. And so this can be generalized to any kind of sort of generalized Markov model. And so the scheme is the following. I estimate my distances from the sequences, and then I recover the topology by running one of those sort of standard algorithms for recovering the topology from the distances. And so once you do that, this can be done efficiently, and somehow the most famous example, I guess, is neighbor joining. I'm not going to show you how neighbor joining works. I just want to show you a sort of an example of how you recover some topological information from your distance matrices. I don't know if somebody showed that before, but let me just show it again. Suppose that I have a tree on 4 leaves. And as we said, several people said that before, somehow the root is not identifiable. So I'm going to start forgetting about the root, and I just have unrooted trees. And once you have unrooted trees, there's really just one topology that you can have on 4 leaves, except that in my case, the leaves are labeled, and that's important. So here I want to know, is A sister with B, or is A sister with C, or is A sister with D? Okay? And so suppose that I look at this quantity, which is the distance between A and C, plus the distance between B and D, and so on. And I claim that this actually helps me distinguish between these 3 configurations, and it works as follows. So if I take the sum between A and C, plus the distance between B and D, I subtract AB, I subtract CD, I get twice the length of this middle edge. This is a positive quantity. Now, suppose that I do the same thing on this one, AC plus BD minus AB minus CD, I get minus twice the length of this middle edge. This time it's negative. And if you do the same thing here, you would get 0. Okay? So if I know exactly my distance matrix, by doing tricks like that, you can actually recover topologies on 4 leaves. And now I suppose that you have a tree with n leaves. Well, one way to do it is you would look at all 4 tuples of leaves, which we call quartets, and then you figure out what the topology is for each one of these quartets, and then it's like a little puzzle. You have to put all these pieces together to get the full tree. And it's easy to see that it's actually easy to do, and it can be done efficiently. So neighbor joining is a little bit different, but it's a similar flavor type of method. Now, so I think Joe yesterday said that neighbor joining methods in practice are actually not so bad, but they're not necessarily as good as other techniques that people have been studying. From a theoretical point of view, the glass is sort of half full and half empty, depending how you look at it. From the computational complexity point of view, it's a very efficient technique. If you now look at the information theoretic complexity, it's more of a disaster. So if I look at how long do my sequences need to be, or how many samples do I need from my model to actually recover the correct tree with high probability, it turns out that you need really, really long sequences. And the reason is, so for a technique like this to work, you need to be able to sort of correctly estimate all distances between all pairs of leaves. And somehow things that are very far away, there's a lot of variance in the estimate that you get. And those long distances are not going to be correctly estimated unless you have really, really long sequences. So you can write a formula like this where you get the length of the sequences depending on how long the distance you're trying to estimate is and how precise you want to be. And so if m, so suppose that my edges, all my edge weights are sort of constant. In general, the diameter of my tree could be of order n. So if I take a long linear tree, and so if I plug m to be order n, I get that k has to be exponentially growing in the number of leaves. And this is really not good. I need extremely long sequences to be sure that this algorithm returns the correct thing. So what we'd like to do is to, well, we have shorter sequences. Suppose that I'm allowing polynomial length sequences. What's going to happen is that m is going to be strictly smaller than the actual diameter of my tree. And I'm going to get a picture of this type where around each leaf, so suppose that I fix k to be polynomial, m is going to be something like log n. Around each leaf, there's a sort of ball of radius m where all my distances are actually pretty accurate. And now if I try to estimate distances between this leaf and something outside of it, I get a very distorted kind of picture. So I have this sort of window around each leaf that I can work with. So more precisely, we call an estimate d to be epsilon m distortion if you're within a radius m, the estimate is within epsilon of the true distance. And now the question is, around each leaf, I sort of see what's happening. Can I sort of put all these pieces together and get the full tree? This time, not with exponentially many samples, but say with polynomially many samples, which is much slower function. What's going on? Okay. And there's been quite a bit of work about this. So the first work was Erdos, Steele, Zekeli, and Warnow, and it turns out that you can. So suppose that, again, my edge weights are sort of bounded between two constants. You can indeed have an algorithm which is good in both sense. It's sort of polynomial time and requires only fairly short sequences which sort of grow polynomially with the number of samples. And since then, we've sort of been expanding on this work and sort of removing the first assumption as long as you're OK with sort of weaker solutions. So let me just show you sort of how it works. And the idea is really I'm building things in a sort of radius of size m around leaves, and then I try to piece all these pieces together. OK, so I suppose that this is the tree that I'm trying to reconstruct. I allow myself to have, say, polynomial length sequences. So if you plug it back in my formula, m would have to be of order log n. Again, the diameter of a tree can actually be of order n. But one of the key points is that even though the diameter can be large, each edge can actually not be that far away from the leaves. You can show it's actually easy that each edge is on at least one path of length log n between two leaves. And so if I'm trying to reconstruct this edge, for example, well, first of all, I'm going to think of each edge as defining a bipartition between the leaves. So there's going to be the leaves on one side which are pink, and the leaves on the other side which are blue. And once, if for each edge you know what the bipartition is, you can sort of put all of those together to recover the full tree. So my goal is to find the bipartition for each one of these edges. Now I'm going to use this fact there, the fact that every edge is on a short path. So there's going to be two leaves at distance, say, order of log n, on which my edge is. And now I'm going to take m to be sufficiently large compared to this, the length of this path. So I'm going to take it sort of 10 times that. And what it means is that I can now take a big ball of radius m, which includes my two leaves and the edge that I'm trying to reconstruct. And now what happens is that inside this ball, I have this sort of precise estimate of all the distances. And so I can use the simple algorithms that I talked about, like neighbor joining, for example, to recover the tree structure inside the ball. And now the question is somehow, how do I extend it to the rest? So if I apply my algorithm, I'll find what the tree structure is. In particular, I'll know what the partition is inside this ball. And now how do I find which side of the partition each other leaf is? Well, suppose that I start with this leaf. So consider the following thing. Suppose that I start from my leaf, and I'm going to try to reach the ball by jumping from one leaf to another with paths of length m over 2. Okay, so I start from there. I try to get closer by taking a path of length m over 2 to another leaf, and then I repeat until I reach the ball of radius m. My claim is that this is going to land on one of the two sides, and this is going to tell me which side this leaf is actually on. And it's going to allow me to extend the partition of this edge to everything. And the reason somehow is that m over 2 was chosen large enough that you can sort of jump from any leaf to any other leaf. So everything is connected. On the other hand, m over 2 is small enough that I cannot just sort of jump completely over this ball. So eventually I reach one of the sides, and you can show that you'll always reach the right side of the partition. And so the way the algorithm actually works is for each pair of leaves that are sufficiently close, I do this big ball around them, I find all the edges sort of on the path between them, and I figure out how to extend them to the rest of the graph. And once I have all the edges, I can recover my tree. And this can be done efficiently. I've only used things that are sort of within distance m, so I only use my sort of local metric. Everything is sort of accurate, and eventually with polynomial length sequences I get the full tree. And what we can show actually is that this first assumption is not actually required. So you can have general edge weights everywhere, except that what's going to happen is that, suppose that you have a certain sequence length k, there might be some edges that are just sort of too deep to reach them with a ball of radius m. And so those, you're just going to remove them. And there might be some edges that are so short that you don't see them in the data, and you'll end up contracting them. So you can sort of have a version of this algorithm that returns a contracted forest. And it's sort of the best, somehow, subforest that you can find, in a sense, with the amount of data that you have. So this idea of sort of decomposing the graph in smaller pieces and putting them back together can actually use also to reconstruct the parameters. So John talked about, sometimes biologists are interested in reconstructing the transition matrices. I could do the same thing here. So if I have a model where my transition matrices all have sort of one parameter, this is usually going to be related to the edge weights. And once I reconstructed my tree with my distance matrix, I can figure out what the edge weights are and recover what that parameter is. But in general, I have this general transition kernel with all these parameters, and you have to do something else to sort of recover everything. And so suppose that I have this tree on 3 leaves, so A, C, and B. And I'm going to denote PAM, the sort of integrated transition probability. So PAMIH is going to be the probability that M is in state H, given that A is in state I. So I have these general matrices on all these edges, and I'm trying to figure out what they are from the data. And I think of A as being the root, even though it's also a leaf. And so what I'm going to do is the following. Suppose that I consider this quantity, which sort of is out of nowhere. So the probability that, well, the joint probability of BC given A, basically. You can just write this out as, using the Markov property. You get this kind of thing. You simplify a little bit. You write this in matrix form. And you get this equation, which is turns out to be really useful. So PAB gamma here is just the matrix where I fix gamma here, and I and j are my indices. So why is this useful? Well, first of all, on this side of the equation, I have something that depends only on the distribution at the leaves. PAB is sort of the joint distribution between A and B. PAB gamma is something, again, related to the joint distribution of A, B, and C. This is something that I can actually estimate from my sequences. And so I can estimate this side of the equation, and then the other side is an eigenvalue decomposition, where the eigenvectors are exactly the matrix that I'm trying to estimate. Okay, so for this to work, well, first of all, I would need to have my eigenvalues to be all different so that my sort of eigenspaces are all of dimension 1. Otherwise, it's not clear how you can recover the eigenvectors. Well, the different rows of my matrix And for this, we use the following trick. So in general, my transition matrix for MC is general. And so there might be some entries that are identical. But suppose that I add one extra edge, which is just sort of imaginary edge, where I put a random transition matrix. And now I can do the same calculation, but I replace C with D. And because this matrix is random with high probability, all these entries are going to be different now. And that's going to give me a system that I can actually invert. So I'm going to get one vector somehow for each of my rows. And now, if you remember yesterday, Jun-Young Kim talked about these general models, the fact that they're identifiable, but up to a sort of permutation of the rows of the matrices. And in this case, somehow I get the vectors, but I don't know exactly how they're oriented, unless I make some assumptions on the structure of these matrices. If I made some further assumptions like the diagonals would be larger than the other entries, I would end up figuring out somehow what the correct labeling is. Yes?
So on the right-hand side, you don't have these, right?
That's true, yes. This side somehow depends on A, B, and C. The C is hidden in there. Somehow when you multiply by PAB inverse, you sort of get rid of the B, yes. It's really just that you multiply by PAB inverse, and you just replace MB by MA.
So the, and the asymmetric A and B is like a condition on the statistical.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
But the other marginal somehow.
Something like that, yes. Yes. It's a little magical, but it turns out that it works. So this is not due to us, this is due to Chang. This is the same paper, I think, that Jun-Young mentioned about the identifiability of these models. And now, what I really want to do is, of course, I have this general tree with n leaves, and I want to use this trick somehow to recover all the transition matrices. So what I would do is I would take all sort of triples of leaves. Say I take one, if I take an arbitrary triple of leaves, these AM would actually now become paths in my graph, not just edges. But I could choose, say, M to be the guy that's right next to A, and then C and B in the two sort of subtrees there. And I would get PAM to be an actual edge. And then I can sort of recurse by finding the transition matrix on, say, two consecutive edges. And by the Markov property, I just sort of invert the first one, and I get the second one. And I go on like this until I get each transition matrix in my tree. Now, the problem is that if I do this over a diameter of size n, the errors that I make just start accumulating. And you have to figure out how to deal with that. And it turns out that it's a similar trick to what we've done before. You have to somehow decompose your graph into pieces of size, basically log n. And you reconstruct everything inside each one of these pieces. And then you have to figure out somehow how you connect them together. But this turns out not to be so difficult. And the condition for all of this to work is that the determinant of P has to be bounded away from 0. So I need things to be sort of invertible for this to work. But eventually, with polynomial length sequences in polynomial time, you can recover the tree, and you can also recover all the transition matrices. And this, as far as I know, is the only techniques for which we can actually prove this kind of result. I should have said something, right? I said that this distance matrix method is polynomial time and recovers the correct tree. Yesterday, when Joe talked about distance matrix method, he said, in general, they're actually NP hard. And this is true, but this is where the distinction between sort of arbitrary data set and model-generated data set is important. If I give you an arbitrary matrix of distances, and I tell you, find me the additive metric that's closest to that in some norm L1 or L infinity, that would be NP hard. But if I give you a matrix that has this sort of distorted metric property, which I can get from my polynomial length sequences, then the problem becomes a lot easier in a sense. Okay, so far this is what we have proved. We can recover phylogenies in polynomial time with polynomial length sequences. And the next question I want to ask is, well, this is already pretty nice, but can I actually do even better than that? And the reason you might be asking this question is because of the following sort of naive argument. I'm especially interested in how long do my sequences really need to be? Is polynomial really the best I can do? And now, if you just think about this naively, if you have an algorithm that reconstructs phylogenies, I mean, with high probability for any phylogeny, it should be the case somehow that you have at least sort of one data set for each possible tree that you have. And if you just count the number of trees, which is this number, and you equal that to the number of possible data sets, which would be maybe 4 to the nk, you need k to be at least log n for these things to be sort of equal. And the question is, well, log n is a lot smaller than polynomial, and the question is somehow which one is the right answer? Can you actually go all the way down to log n, or is polynomial really the best you can do, or is it somewhere in between? And to answer this question, I have to go into some related problems which are sort of connected to statistical physics. So let me just sort of make it clear what the problem is here. Suppose that I'm trying to get an algorithm which uses only very short sequences of length log n, and plug this back into my estimate of how accurate my distances are going to be. Right? So if I have k on this side to be of order log n, it means that m somehow has to be of order 1. So now I don't even have a ball of size log n around each leaf. I have an extremely tiny ball around each leaf. And if I just take the union of all these balls, somehow the best I can recover, it seems, is just this tiny fraction of the tree, which is sort of very, very close to the leaves. And so one of the things, again, that Joe mentioned yesterday about distance matrix methods is one of their disadvantages is that they don't actually use the full data set. Now you take your data set and you sort of map it to these summary statistics, which are these distances, and you might actually be losing a lot of information when you do that. And one of the corollaries of this result is going to be a sort of dramatic instance of this, where seemingly if you use only distance matrix methods, you recover a tiny fraction of your tree, whereas if you use the full data set, you can recover everything. Okay, and to understand what other information I'm going to use, I have to talk about a related problem, which is the ancestral sequence reconstruction problem. Okay? So now I have this tree. Suppose that I know what the tree is. I look at one site at all my species. I see a bunch of A, G, Z, and C, and T's. And now I'd like to guess what the value was at one of the internal nodes. Okay, was it A, G, C, or T? And the question somehow is, how accurately can I do this reconstruction? And if you think about it, there's a sort of fight between two things here. I start at the root. If you start at the root and you go down one of those paths, you have all these sort of mutations that arise, and you get this sort of noisier and noisier version of your initial value. On the other hand, this tree is actually growing exponentially, and so you get a large number of copies of this process, and this helps you. And there's a sort of fight between these two things, and the question somehow is which one wins. And physicists have sort of studied this question, and probabilists, and what turns out to be the case is that you have this sort of very sharp transition where, suppose that I fix my mutation rates to be U, and I just sort of expand or contract my edge lengths. When you have short branches, it turns out that there's actually a way of estimating very accurately what the ancestral sequences were. But then you reach a critical threshold where if your branches are a bit longer, all of a sudden it's essentially impossible to get any information about the ancestral sequences, or at least it decays very, very fast as the size of the tree grows. And it turns out that this question that I was asking about, how long do my sequences need to be, is it log n or is it poly n, depends precisely on what side of this picture you're on. Okay, so if you're on the side of this picture where you can actually reconstruct accurately the ancestral sequences, you can actually use that explicitly to give a much better algorithm for reconstructing phylogenies, which would use only sequences of length log n. And then if you cross this threshold and you sort of lose the information about ancestral sequences, then you can show that you need, in fact, polynomially many samples, or sequences of length polynomial. So Elkanan showed this first result, and we prove a couple of years ago or a year ago, the result on this side. So I want to show a little bit how this algorithm actually works. And this is just going to be a sort of cartoonish version of it. And so again, remember my original picture with these little windows. So at first when I start, and if I just use my distances, I get a sort of accurate picture of what's going on very, very close to the leaves. And so I could actually use that to reconstruct, a few levels of my tree. But then eventually I reach my radius of precision, and now I don't know how to go forward. And this is where I'm going to use the ancestral reconstruction part. I know that I'm in this regime where I can reconstruct ancestral sequences somewhat accurately, and I'm going to try to guess what the ancestral sequences were at the top of this, what I've built so far, and then I'm going to repeat. I'm going to use these ancestral sequences to compute distances between these internal nodes now, and I'm going to construct a few more levels, and then I'm going to infer sequences even further down, and I'm going to construct a few more levels until I finally have the full tree. And the fact that I'm in this sort of reconstruction phase means that the error that I make on these ancestral sequences is bounded, and even as I go very, very, very deep inside the tree, I still have a good precision on these ancestral sequences. Now, this works well for sort of nice symmetric trees. I'll say in a second what these red edges are. But if you have a general tree, you have to sort of be careful how you go about reconstructing this. And I'm not going to show you in detail how it works, but just to give you an idea. What we do is we sort of build a forest, a subforest of the true tree. And one of the key points is, from a combinatorial point of view, is you have to make sure that this forest is what we call, or what Elkanon called, edge disjoint. So suppose that I've built one subtree on these leaves, another subtree on these leaves. What I don't want to have is a situation where in the true tree, if I draw these trees, they're correct somehow, but they're all sort of entangled within each other. Because eventually I would have to sort of untangle them and figure out what's happening. So what I'm going to do is, at each step, we're going to build a forest which is always sort of disjoint inside the true tree. So this is the first thing. And now the key point somehow is, how do you correctly estimate distances but between internal nodes? I know how to do this for leaves, but then as I go down the tree, I get these ancestral sequences. I can use them to try to compute distances between nodes. But there's some sort of probabilistic subtleties that happen here. So suppose that I've built these two subtrees. They're edge disjoint like I want. And now I'm going to try to estimate the ancestral sequence at this node. So this is some function of what's happening below it. So it's basically a sort of majority of what's going on beyond. It's not quite that, but it's something like that. So I get some function of my leaves, which is going to give me an ancestral sequence. And the ancestral sequence is not exact, but it has some sort of bias into it. And I can think of this bias as being a sort of extra edge in my Markov model. And so now when I'm going to estimate distances between my two ancestral sequences, what I have is a sort of overestimate where I compute the distances between these two red nodes. And you have to figure out how to deal with that. And it turns out that what you can do is instead, suppose that I compute the distances, so I reconstruct my ancestral sequences here instead, so sort of one level below. And so there's going to be a bias on each one of those. And now I'm going to use the sort of standard quartet method to recover the internal edge, which is the path between these two nodes. So this is what I had before. I think of A, B, C, D as like this. And this edge now is actually the path between these two nodes. And this is what I'm trying to compute. And now even though there's a bias on these nodes, when I apply the standard 4-point method, I actually get the correct estimate of the distances between my two roots there, even though there's a bias in my estimates. But now it's a little bit more complicated than that, which is, as I'm building this tree, I don't actually know what's happening in between. And here it turns out to be crucial that I drew this path sort of above these two nodes. If you think about how the Markov model works, if I condition on these two values, the bias, which is just a function of what I had below, is going to depend only on what's happening on this side and what's happening on this side. And these two things are going to be independent. And this is crucial to have this sort of analogy with Markov edges. And so what happens if, in general, I have a path between these two subtrees, which is in between somewhere. And now, if you just look at it, it turns out that you cannot do this picture anymore. These biases are not independent, and then you have to figure out how to compute these distances again. And so somehow you don't know which situation you're in, and that's sort of the key point. And it turns out that what you can do instead is suppose that, again, I go sort of one level down. Instead of computing the distances between these two, I compute the distance between this one and this one. And if you're thinking about how the path goes above them, it actually goes, again, above them. And this is the good situation that I had before. And now I can use my previous trick to compute the distance between these two nodes. And in general, I don't know which one of these, the four possibilities is in this nice configuration. And so what I'll do, I'll just compute all four possibilities, so all pairs of the second level trees. If I get the same answer 4 times, I know it's correct because at least one of them is correct. And if I get one of them which is different from the other ones, somehow that's a signal that I'm in this bad configuration and I should just ignore whatever calculations that I've made. And so what happens is you have this distance now estimates between internal nodes. You know when it's sort of correct, you know when it's not correct. And now that you have distances between internal nodes, you can try to figure out how to patch things together and sort of go a few more levels at a time. And this is sort of how the algorithm works. So to conclude, let me just mention some future directions. So the first one is, I gave you all these theoretical results. You might ask, well, how does it work, in practice? Can you actually implement this algorithm? Well, we have started implementing some of these, and if you run them on simulated data, we don't really have any result at this point, but they actually look like they work and they might be interesting. We haven't tried real data sets, but that's harder to sort of assess what you've been doing. And now, from the theoretical point of view, there's sort of 2 different directions that you could take. One which is interesting is to understand further how the sort of classical methods work, like maximum likelihood or maximum parsimony. I said there's lots of things that we don't know about these techniques on how accurate they are, how much data you need, and so on. So you could try to explore that further. And then there's another direction, which is just to try to extend this type of algorithm to more general or more realistic models, things like mixtures or models taking into account population genetic effects like we saw in Luai talk, or sort of networks. And well, this is exactly what Elkanan will talk about in a couple of talks, so I'm going to let him tell you what we know, or especially what we don't know about this. Thank you. Yes?
For Sebastian. Yes.
So, I guess this gives you some guarantees that you can keep the branch lengths bounded if you don't want to go to the protracted forest.
Yes.
Then you need these bounds on the branch length. They can't be too small and they can't be too large.
So for
If you want to get this logarithmic dependence.
for the second result, you mean? Or the first one?
Mixing together all your results.
Yes, so in general, if you don't have any bounds on how long your edges are, in the first part, you can still get something, but it's going to be a forest. You're going to have to remove some edges that are just too deep. You would have to know, yes.
Well, I just was going to say that one of the problems is that sometimes proofs like that of the sort of the earlier sort as well, the Erdos et al., have the property that you say, well, imagine getting larger and larger numbers of tips, but keeping the shortest branch length bounded the largest.
Right.
The largest branch length bounded. And a lot of different ways you might imagine trees arising, such as, for example, birth deck processes and models like that, won't have that property. The shortest branches will, as you get more and more tips, the shortest branches will get shorter.
That's
In my book, I gave a little back of the envelope, approximate calculation. I figured in that case, the number of characters you needed was not log n, it's more like n squared log n.
right. So you're right. In general, if you grow these,
Assuming you can keep those bounds and increase the number of species, may mean something special about where you got the trees from.
Yes, so you somehow have to have some sort of deep, dense sampling of your species. It's sort of an interesting question. What can you say about sort of more realistic random trees and how these methods extend, but we don't necessarily have good results.
One of the SQL bound, you want to get a full tree. You don't want to contract any shape of this is one of the SQL bound. You look at the fixed time scale and add more and more speeds to it, then you have to do something like this. This is the lower bound that you have to use.
Yes, it's not clear that you can actually do better even with other techniques.
Isn't it wonderful we only need log n star? I don't think a realistic case is
Well, that's why we've sort of been moving to this case where you can contract things and sort of look at forests, and this is a maybe more reasonable solution for more realistic settings.
Well, it depends on how interested you are in those short edges. I mean, if you can track from one edge to the other.
We know that there is one that you can
If it's the edge that connects species,
Yes.
but on the other you prove that there is a that you have to contract in order to get to this. So there is one of the there is a speed that there is one of the SQL that has to be shortest number of samples. So this means that when you do the scaling that you do in your book, there are going to be edges that you are going to have to contract.
Yes.
So you cannot, if you want to get everything, so you somehow build into the
Yes.
But also maybe it also may be that in some deep evolution problems, you really care about the long term. That could be a problem for the next.
That's true. Yes. Yes.
Regarding the anti-hardness of burning off in the trees, are you familiar with your Friedman's work?
About?
He changed the problem slightly to finding a tree that maximizes a particular lower bound on the likelihood.
I haven't
The
seen
lower
that.
bound that comes from structure to the end. And then you can show it's polynomial using Chang.
Really? Okay. I didn't know about that. Good. Thank you.
I wondered how it relates to the proofs of
Okay.
not the anti-hardness of approximation.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
Hey, the great thing about this is we get people from Microsoft to meet each other and start talking to each other. Okay, so we've got a break for 20 minutes now.